Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. In commemoration of Memorial Day, I would like to speak to you today about one of the American Revolution's greatest naval heroes. This gentleman is one of the reasons why we today call ourselves Americans. Without further ado, I present to you John Paul Jones by Brother Dave Van Pelt. John Paul Jones was America's greatest revolutionary naval commander and the founder of America's naval tradition. He was the first hero of the United States Navy. His life was one of mystery and intrigue. There are many serious gaps in the history of his life that can be attributed to his being a world traveler and military and naval innovator. He was born simply John Paul at an estate named Arbogland in Kirkcudbright on the Scottish coast on July 6, 1747. His father was no nobleman. He was the gardener for the Arbogland estate, and the Paul family lived in a small but comfortable cottage. His mother, Jean, was the daughter of a small farmer. John Paul was the fourth of 7 children. He had the usual course of study at a village school in Kirkbean, and by the time he was 13, he was ready to go to sea to embark on his destiny. With the assistance of his relatives, he found an apprenticeship with a local ship owner. This was not an unusual choice for teenage boys growing up on the Scottish coast, and his parents gave their blessing. He immediately entered into the Atlantic trade that linked England, America, the West Indies, and Africa. John Paul's first voyages were aboard the merchant brig Friendship out of Whitehaven. The Friendship was not a large vessel. It measured perhaps 80 to 85 feet by 22 feet. But she was ocean-worthy, and her crew of 28 knew how to handle both her sails and her 18-deck guns, which she needed, for in those days, merchant vessels might be harassed by pirates or enemy nations. For 3 years, John Paul sailed the Friendship on her yearly voyage from Whitehaven to Barbados to Virginia. Her triangle trade sent out consumer goods to Barbados, where she picked up rum and sugar in its place. In Virginia, those were exchanged for tobacco, pig iron, and barrel wood. Fredericksburg, Virginia was home to John Paul's older brother, William. William worked as a tailor in the busy colonial port, living at the corner of what is now Caroline Street and Lafayette Boulevard. William had an unhappy marriage and left no children, but during the visits, his younger brother John became excited about the American colony's prospects. After the French and Indian War ended, Britain experienced a recession. Back in Whitehaven, the Friendship was sold and her crew let go. 16-year-old John Paul had 3 years' worth of sailing experience, but was now without work, as were many seamen. Eventually, he accepted work as a third mate aboard the King George. The King George was a slaver, also known as a blackbirder, taking advantage of the still legal status on the importation of slaves. John Paul served on the King George for 2 years. He then took a post as first mate aboard another slaver called the Two Friends. But after just one voyage aboard the Two Friends, he resigned, never again serving as part of what he would later call that abominable trade. When his ship tour was paid in Jamaica, he was able to find a ride home to Britain with a friendly Scot, also from Kirkcudbright, aboard the brigantine John. After the captain and chief mate of the ship died of fever, John brought the ship back to port safely. The owners were so appreciative that they gave John Paul command of a cargo ship at the age of 21. 21-year-old John Paul and 6 other crew members made 2 round-trip voyages to Jamaica in the John. With the John's owner's full recommendations, John Paul's next command came in 1772 when he took charge of the 3-masted brig, the Betsy of London. The Betsy made good money for Captain Paul, but she was a leaky vessel, and some of the crew became mutinous over a pay issue. While in Tobago, the ringleader, whom John Paul later described as a prodigious brute of thrice my strength, swung at him with the club. The small-sized Captain Paul ran him through with his sword. Since his assailant was a local to Tobago, John Paul's friends urged him to consider leaving the island quickly, not trusting the local authorities to give him a fair hearing. He did exactly that, adding the name Jones to John Paul. From here on out, he would be known as Captain John Paul Jones. Revolution is in the air. He arrived in America in 1774 at a time when the conflict with Britain over taxes and self-government was reaching a boiling point. Familiar from birth with Great Britain's harsh treatment of the Scottish people, Jones was immediately sympathetic to America's quest for liberty. In 1775, after the battles at Lexington and Concord, John Paul Jones traveled to Philadelphia and offered his services to the new Continental Navy. Having long been protected by the powerful British Navy, America began the Revolutionary War without naval power of any kind. Congress acted quickly to convert merchant ships to ships of war and to begin building new ships for the Navy. With his seagoing background and the support of a North Carolina congressman, Jones was quick to see service. Jones was appointed as first lieutenant on the newly converted 24-gun frigate USS Alfred in the Continental Navy on December 7, 1775. Jones sailed from the Delaware River in February 1776 aboard the Alfred on the Continental Navy's Maiden Cruise. It was aboard this vessel that Jones took the honor of hoisting the first U.S. ensign, the Grand Union flag, over a naval vessel. The fleet had been expected to cruise along the coast, but was ordered instead by Commodore Essex Hopkins to sail for the Bahamas, where Nassau had been raided for military supplies. The fleet had an unsuccessful encounter with a British packet ship on their return voyage. Jones was then assigned full command of the USS Providence, which mounted 21 guns. Congress had recently ordered the construction of 13 frigates for the American Navy, one of which was to be commanded by Jones. In exchange for this prestigious command, Jones accepted his commission aboard the smaller Providence. Over the summer of 1776, as commander of the Providence, Jones performed various services for the Continental Navy and Congress. These services included the transport of troops, the movement of supplies, and the escort of convoys. During a later 6-week voyage to Nova Scotia, Jones captured 16 prizes or vessels and inflicted significant damage on the raid on Canso. Jones's next command came as a result of Commodore Hopkins' orders to liberate hundreds of American prisoners forced to labor in coal mines in Nova Scotia, and also to raid British shipping. On November 1st, 1776, Jones set sail in command of the USS Alfred to carry out this mission. Winter conditions prevented freeing the prisoners, but the mission did result in the capture of Mellish, a vessel carrying a vital supply of winter clothing intended for General John Burgoyne's troops in Canada. The Mellish captured cargo of 10,000 complete winter uniforms and other equipment were especially appreciated by George Washington and his freezing troops at Valley Forge in the days before they crossed the Delaware for a surprise attack at Trenton. John Paul Jones continued his patrol of the New England coast until July of 1777, when he took command of the newly built USS Ranger, named in honor of American riflemen, this on the same day that the new Stars and Stripes flag was adopted. The Ranger was a specially constructed warship, not a converted merchant vessel. On June 14, 1777, Congress passed 2 separate resolutions. The first, that the flag of the that the flag of the 13 United States of America be 13 stripes, alternating red and white. That the Union be 13 stars in a blue field representing a new constellation. The second resolution passed was that Captain John Paul Jones be appointed to command the ship Ranger. Jones was so moved by this that he wrote, "The flag and I are twins, born the same hour from the same womb of destiny. We cannot be parted in life or in death. So long as we can float, we shall float together. If we must sink, we shall go down as one." It was in the European area, however, that Jones won lasting acclaim. John Paul Jones sailed for France on November 1st, 1777, with orders to assist the American cause however possible. The American commissioners in France were Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee, and they listened to Jones's strategic recommendations. In Paris, he found American diplomat Benjamin Franklin sympathetic to his strategic objectives, hit-and-run attacks on the enemy's defenseless places, and abduction of a prominent person to compel the British government to exchange American seamen rotting in English jails. On the 10th of April, 1778, Jones sailed from Brest, France, in the Ranger with a crew of about 140 men and armed with 18 6-pounders and 6 swivel guns, heading for the home waters of his youth. He raided Whitehaven off the British coast. On the 28th of April, he then made an unsuccessful attempt to capture the Earl of Selkirk, planning to use him as a hostage to assure the proper treatment of American prisoners. The Earl was away from home, however, and thus escaped capture. Crossing the Irish Sea to Carrickfergus, Jones captured the British sloop Drake in a brilliant one-hour battle in which Jones lost 8 men and inflicted on the enemy 40 or more casualties. On the 8th of May, he returned to Brest with 7 prizes and numerous prisoners to show for his 28 days at sea. His cruise had spread fear and dismay along a considerable portion of the English coast, and it marked the start of his international fame. On February 6, 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance with America, formally recognizing the independence of the new American Republic. The French, whose war with England was about to start, hailed Jones as a hero, and the authorities called him to Paris in June for consultation on ways of employing naval forces against England. On February 4, 1779, he was informed that the old East Indiaman Duras with 40 guns was placed under his command for joint Army and Navy operations against enemy ports. Marquis de Lafayette was to command the Army element, Jones the naval, but the plans were ultimately abandoned. By the summer, however, the French had outfitted a small fleet of 5 naval vessels and 2 privateers for Jones. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac was very popular in France at the time that Jones was refitting the Duras, and since he was greatly indebted to Franklin for his support, Jones renamed his flagship the Bonhomme Richard, which is the French translation for Franklin's Poor Richard. With the American flag flying over a flotilla financed by France and with most of the ships commanded by French officers resentful of his authority, Jones put to sea from La Orient on the 14th of August, 1779, sailing clockwise around the British Isles, up the west coast of Ireland, around Scotland, and to the coast of Yorkshire. Jones captured 17 ships and made an unsuccessful attempt to capture the port of Leith and hold it for ransom. On September 23rd, the 41 British ships of the Baltic convoy came into view off the east coast of England. As the merchant ships ran for safety, the 2 escorting British warships, the 50-gun Serapis and the 20-gun Countess of Scarborough, squared off against the Bonhomme Richard and another American ship, the Pallas. The most spectacular naval battle of the American Revolution followed, a duel between the older Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis, which was a sturdy, new, copper-bottomed frigate. After each captain, in standard tactical fashion, sought unsuccessfully to get across his opponent's bow and deliver a broadside, Jones managed to lash his ship to the Serapis in order to grapple and board. Jones's sharpshooters soon drove the enemy from the Serapis's deck with their rain of musket and grenade fire, but below the deck the enemy cannon roared on, wrecking the Bonhomme Richard's topside. The battle lasted for several hours, leaving the Richard slowly sinking from the raking by the Serapis's 18-pound guns, leading to Jones making his famous pronouncement, "I have not yet begun to fight." Yet ultimately the victory went to the Americans, in part due to the sheer nerve of one of Jones's men. Scotsman Bill Hamilton crawled across the Richard's main yard with a sack of grenades and tossed them into the Serapis's main hatch, igniting an explosion of powder cartridges. After that devastation, Captain Pearson of the Serapis surrendered. Both crews sustained heavy casualties, and Jones received a head wound. The Bonhomme Richard's crew was transferred to the captured Serapis and the other American ships. Although Jones tried hard to save the Richard, she sank beneath the waves the following day, taking some of Jones's personal belongings with it. In Jones's blasted and ruined luxury cabin, Pearson offered his host his sword, and the 2 men cordially drank glasses of wine as the Poor Richard continued to sink beneath them. In this battle, John Paul Jones's legend of a great naval hero began. John Paul Jones's victory inspired his French allies in the young country that was very much embroiled with land battles. He received many military honors and a special gold medal, which he helped design, that was struck to commemorate the victory. On one side showed his facial profile, and on the other had the victorious but doomed Bonhomme Richard. Despite his famous success, John Paul Jones had a difficult time finding a command worthy of his accomplishments. Benjamin Franklin assured his protege that his honorable conduct and persevering bravery were the talk of Paris and Versailles. Proud as the French were of him, they considered this captured Serapis to be French property, as the Richard had technically belonged to them while Jones captained her. Still, while looking for a position, Jones kept busy. His rock star status, good looks, and gentle manners earned him much appreciation. The French king, Louis XVI, gave him the Order of Military Merit, which allowed him to sign his name, Cavalier Paul Jones, which he sometimes did. Abigail Adams, wife to the future president, wrote of Jones, "Under all this appearance of softness, he is bold, enterprising, ambitious, and active. He has been here often and dined with us several times. He is said to be a man of gallantry and a favorite amongst the French ladies." After being abroad for more than 3 years, Jones reached Philadelphia on the 18th of February, 1781. Senior officers, namely Captains Thomas Reed and James Nicholson, blocked a resolution of Congress to make Jones a rear admiral, but on the 26th of June, Congress gave him command of the largest ship of the Continental Navy, the 76-gun America, which was then under construction at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. After more than a year's frustration in constructing the vessel, Jones saw the America turned over to the French. The best Jones was able to do thereafter was to get permission to sail aboard the flagship of the Marquis Vanderall, and he left with the French fleet from Boston for a 4-month cruise in the West Indies. After the Continental Navy was disbanded, Jones got authority to return to Europe as an agent to collect prize money due to the United States as a result of his operations during the war. His mission was successful, although payment was slow. Jones returned to the United States for the last time in the summer of 1787. And on October 16th, Congress voted him the only gold medal awarded to an officer of the Continental Navy. Soon afterward, he accepted a commission from Catherine the Great to serve in the Russian Navy and was put in command of the Black Sea Squadron with the rank of Rear Admiral. That rank, which he had eagerly but unsuccessfully sought in America, was the bait that had lured him to Russia. He fought in the Linman campaign against the Turks. On the 29th of May, 1788, he raised his flag on a squadron in the Black Sea, but although he played a key role in the naval operations that cleared the way for the capture of the Turkish fortress at Ochkov, his position in the Russian service was undermined by a jealous French adventurer, Prince Nassau-Siegen. After he rejected another prince's offer of command of the Sevastopol fleet, Jones was forced into idleness and returned to St. Petersburg. There he fell victim to a false, malicious rumor that he had violated a young girl. In September 1789, after receiving the Order of St. Anne, he went to Empress Catherine, hoping to get another command, but instead he received an official leave of absence. Between his newfound notoriety and the Empress's coldness toward him, it was time to leave Mother Russia and return to Paris. He left St. Petersburg with nothing but bitterness to show for his Russian experience. Unfortunately, the Paris to which John Paul Jones returned was not the glittering jewel that it once had been. The French were experiencing their own revolution, and his health was very poor. In 1792, U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson wrote to tell him that President George Washington had appointed Jones a commissioner to negotiate with Algiers for peace and the release of imprisoned American citizens. Jones never lived to receive the letter. His health steadily declined before his death on July 18, 1792, from dropsy, pneumonia, and a heart condition. He was 45 years old. Jones's French friends paid for the funeral, and he was buried in a lead-lined coffin in a cemetery for Protestant foreigners in Paris, France. They also took care to preserve his body in alcohol so that he might be better paid proper honors when the madness of the world subsided and the United States remembered her hero. It was a long time coming, but some 113 years later, in 1905, under orders from the President of the United States and fellow brother, Theodore Roosevelt, American authorities located his coffin in the now overbuilt cemetery. They were able to find it relatively easy because it was lined with lead. The body was moved back to America with a lavish show as 11 battleships saw him back home over the seas with a great ceremony. Fredericksburg was among the places that vied to be his final resting place, but in the end, the Naval Academy Chapel at Annapolis was chosen. The body of John Paul Jones rests in an ornate crypt, carved with the names of his fighting vessels at the base. John Paul Jones and Freemasonry. John Paul Jones lived a short but very full life. Reading about his life is almost like reading fiction, from his lowly birth, his almost meteoric rise in the American Navy, and his attainment of the rank of Rear Admiral in the Russian Navy. His love of the Masonic craft was second only to his love of liberty and the United States. He lived his life according to the Masonic principles that he studied. John Paul Jones, Mason, diplomat, seaman, and a man who was admired by his friends and his enemies alike. At the age of 23, John Paul became a member of the St. Bernard's Masonic Lodge, number 122, now the St. Cuthbert Kilwinning Lodge, number 41, in Kirkcudbright, Scotland, and was raised to Master Mason on November 27, 1770. The actual original copy of his Masonic petition for St. Bernard's Lodge is now kept under lock and key at St. Mary's Isle in the waters of the Solway. The petition reads as follows. To the worshipful, the Master, wardens, and permanent brethren of free and accepted Masons of the Lodge of St. Bernard held at Kirkcudbright, the petition of John Paul, commander of the John of Kirkendall, humbly showeth, that your petitioner for a considerable time by past hath entertained a strong and sincere regard for your most noble, honorable, and ancient society of free and accepted Masons, but hitherto not meeting with reasonable opportunity. Do now most humbly crave the benefit of receiving and admitting me into your fraternity as an entered apprentice, promising, assuring, and engaging to you, that I shall on all rules and orders of your lodge be most obsequent and observant, that I shall in all things deport, behave, and act answerable to the laws and instructions of the lodge, and in everything to which I may be liable, promising faithful obedience. The compliance of your right worshipful wardens and the rest of your brethren will singularly oblige and very much honor right worshipful, your most humble petitioner and most humble servant. Signed, John Paul. The early part of the 18th century saw a tremendous spurt in the growth of Freemasonry. The period being a traditional and troubled time, men instinctively sought to band themselves together, swearing to respect and protect each other in a democratic brotherhood of man. The most conspicuous men on both sides of the Atlantic sought the shelter of Masonry. In what was surely one of the darkest moments of his early career, after John Paul killed a mutinous crew member in Tobago and had to flee justice, changing his name to Jones and ending up in America, Masonry drew Captain John Paul Jones back from the very brink of oblivion and set his course toward immortal fame. Landing in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Jones was eager to make the acquaintance of some of the revolutionary leaders. Like many of those powerful men, he was a Mason, welcome at any lodge in the world. George Washington, a well-known Freemason, was a member of Virginia's Fredericksburg Lodge number 4, where Jones resided. John Paul Jones, as we know him, owes much of his appointment as a naval officer to his being a Mason, and to the friendship of men who were Masons. In a letter to Benjamin Franklin, Jones said, I can mention a person whom I very much esteem and who has always expressed great obligation to you. I mean Dr. John K. Reed. Dr. Reed was the son of James Reed, brother of Franklin's wife, Deborah Reed, and was quite influential in politics. He was also afterwards Grand Master of Virginia. The three men who backed Jones and saw that he was given an opportunity to prove his valor were Dr. Reed, Benjamin Franklin, and Joseph Hughes, all devout Freemasons. In June of 1777, the Continental Congress ordered John Paul Jones to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to oversee the completion and take command of the newly built USS Ranger. While there, Jones was said to have visited St. John's Lodge number 1 during his stay in Portsmouth. While in Paris, Jones became a member of La Loge des Neuf Sœurs, or the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which was a prominent French Masonic lodge of the Grand Orient de France that was influential in organizing French support for the American Revolution. In 1778, the year Voltaire became a member, Benjamin Franklin and John Paul Jones were also accepted, along with Jean Sylvan Bailey. Benjamin Franklin became master of the lodge in 1779 and was re-elected in 1780. Other masters of the lodge included Marquis de La Salle, Charles Dupatet, Eli de Beaumont, and Claude Pastoret. After a long and influential stay in Europe, Franklin returned to America to participate in the writing of the U.S. Constitution. John Paul Jones, Man of Action by Philip Russell, makes mention of Freemasonry in this quote. In Paris, at this very moment, 1778, Franklin was a luminary at the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which included among its members Voltaire, Helvetius the philosopher, and Howden the sculptor. At this lodge, Jones was a frequent visitor, and it was here that Howden conceived the idea of making a bust or a statue of Jones, which is deemed to be the best likeness of the captain. The Grand Master of all the Masonic lodges in France was the Duke of Chartres, while the Duchess was a leader in the adoptive lodge of women Freemasons affiliated with the Lodge of Candor. Final honors. On Sunday, April 24th, 2016, several hundred Freemasons honor famed naval leader John Paul Jones with a belated memorial service at the Naval Academy. Well, it had been 110 years since Jones's remains were brought to Annapolis from France to rest in a crypt under the Academy Chapel. Freemasons learned only within the past year that the Revolutionary War hero had never had a Masonic funeral from the oldest fraternal organization in the world. As quoted, "We were going through our records and realized a ceremony had never taken place," said Tom Foster, Director of Communications for the Grand Lodge of Maryland. "Any Mason who dies is entitled to a Masonic funeral service. It is the final honor that we can bestow on our departed brother. Better late than never." Between 200 and 300 Freemasons from across the country, wearing tuxedos, aprons, and white gloves, gathered at the Annapolis Lodge and embarked on a procession to the Academy's Dahlgren Hall. The ceremony featured remarks about Jones, his service, and his masonry, as well as a color guard, a hymn, and a playing of the taps. Final thoughts. So what can be said about Brother John Paul Jones? Like any master mariner in the 18th century, John Paul Jones was in the fullest sense the captain of his ship. He ruled by authority as well as by skill and personality. The rigging, the navigation, the ordnance, and the internal discipline were all his concerns. He was a proud man, slight and wiry, intellectually alert, and as tough with rowdy seamen as he was suave and urbane with Parisian women. John Paul Jones was a Scottish adventurer, an ex-slaver turned pirate in the eyes of the British, who used the American Revolution as an opportunity to get a job. He himself said that, "I have drawn my sword in the present generous struggle for the right of men. Yet I am not in arms as an American, nor am I in pursuit of riches. I profess myself a citizen of the world." Accepting a commission in the Continental Navy, Jones performed his duties with complete political loyalty to the American cause, despite personal disappointments and lack of opportunity to give his remarkable leadership abilities a full test. 19th century Americans saw him as a self-made man, a brave commander who remained cool when battle raged, and the greatest naval hero of the American Revolution. At the turn of the 20th century, biographers began to emphasize the plans that Jones proposed for the young Navy, along with his efforts to increase his professional knowledge, both of which are seen as characteristics of the modern professional naval officer corps. A naval hero, captain, a Freemason, a man of the seas and of the world, a legend forged by battle and the birth of a nation, John Paul Jones, as he will live for eternity, the father of the United States Navy. The sea remembers its own. Thank you, gentlemen.